Hello, I'm Lanethea Mathews-Schultz. I'm chair and professor of political science at Muhlenberg College, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to a conversation with David A. Hopkins. This is the first of several events this semester linked to our election program, 2020 Vision: Contested Political Futures. You may be interested to know that this is the 8th nonpartisan presidential election series that we've hosted at Muhlenberg, the primary purposes of which are to engage in civil debate about emergent issues in American democracy and to foster public spiritedness and engaged citizenship. This year's program, 2020 Vision: Contested Political Futures, begins from a position that recognizes that more than a simple choice in candidates, the 2020 elections point to different possible futures for our nation. We begin our series with a conversation with David A. Hopkins, Associate Professor of Political Science at Boston College. Dr. Hopkins is an expert on American political parties and elections. He is a prolific publisher. His work has appeared in both scholarly and media outlets, including the New York Times and the Washington Post. And he regularly publishes a blog called Honest Graft, where you can find his most recent scholarly musings on American politics. Dr. Hopkins is co-author or author of several books. Of special note, in 2016, he published with his co-author, Asymmetric Politics, Ideological Republicans and Group Interest Democrats. Asymmetric Politics won the American Political Science Association's 2018 Leon Epstein Outstanding Book Award from the section on political organization and parties. And The Economist called it the best recent book about how the two major parties became what they are. More recently, Dr. Hopkins published Red Fighting Blue: How Geography and Electoral Rules Polarize American Politics. This book was named an outstanding academic title by Choice magazine, and it explains how the rise of the culture war in combination with winner-take-all elections has produced a regionally divided electorate and an ideologically polarized political system in the United States. Dr. Hopkins has graciously agreed to spend some time with us today, just about 30 minutes or so, to discuss party politics in the 2020 elections. Dr. Hopkins, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. Pleasure to be here from Boston.
Yeah. I thought that to get started, I could ask you a general question about your perceptions of the 2020 elections, and especially the presidential race. What, if anything, is different or unique about this presidential election?
Well, one of the things that's unique, obviously, about it is the COVID. And what strikes me is not just COVID as a political issue and as, something that's on the minds of voters, and the president's handling of COVID being sort of a top question in this election. But I've also been struck with how COVID has changed just the conduct of campaigns in ways that I think are potentially pretty consequential for the outcome of this election. That we don't have the usual candidates hopscotching around the country, appearing in person to crowds of cheering supporters. And it certainly struck me how much that drives the media coverage and sort of the framing of a presidential campaign. Is every day there's a story about what one candidate said at one rally and what the other candidate said about the other rally. The fact that we haven't had that, I think, has really sort of changed how the media has covered this election. And it's put more focus on the president, I think. It's sort of taken Biden kind of out of the picture, quite literally, for a large part of the campaign. And it's really made the focus even more than it would otherwise be, sort of a referendum on Trump, and sort of Trump is sort of dominating the scene. I've been thinking a lot about whether that maybe, on one hand, you could say maybe that hurt Biden. He doesn't have the same platform to get himself out there. On the other hand, maybe it's actually working out for Biden, that because Trump is not as popular as maybe he'd want to be at this stage in the race, maybe having all the focus on Trump is sort of actually working to Biden's advantage. So, but it's really, it's really a different election, I think, from that point alone.
Yeah, well, maybe we could talk a little bit about a little bit more about the candidates. I know that you wrote a little bit about the nominating conventions, and I'm interested to hear about. I want to say the president for a second. I want to talk about Biden first, if we could, and specifically his selection of Kamala Harris as his running mate. What do Biden and Harris sort of signify or reveal about party politics in 2020 and about the Democratic Party more generally, maybe?
Well, I think Biden being the nominee really says something important about the Democrats. Number one, Democrats, even those who might be kind of on the left ideologically, often think very pragmatically about elections, and they're often very aware that sometimes if you insist on everything you want ideologically, you don't win, and then you don't get anything. And so Biden as the nominee, he really kind of sold himself as, well, maybe I'm not the most passionate or charismatic candidate, but I'm a guy who can win. I'm the guy who's the best choice for the party to actually win the general election against Trump. And that really was a large part of his appeal. And specifically, there's sort of an ideological part of it. I'm not as far to the left as, say, Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. I'm someone who's well-known, has all the experience, not very controversial, but also I'm an older white guy. And so I'm not going to be subject to any kind of, racist or sexist, bias in the electorate. It's going to be easier for me to sort of appeal to the swing voters in the general election than someone who is not male or white. And, I think that's what a lot of Democratic voters were thinking when they supported him for the nomination. But it's still the case that the Democratic Party as a whole is very interested these days in a more diverse set of leaders, in diversifying the sort of cadre of political leaders in the country along both racial and gender lines. That's a big issue. And so I think Biden very much recognized that in his choice of running mate, he probably shouldn't pick another person who was like him. He should probably pick someone who is going to kind of represent the changing face of the Democratic Party and the future where the Democratic Party may be going. And so Kamala Harris, as both a woman and a person of color, really sort of fit that bill. And, again, not someone who's on the left edge of the party, but not someone who's really a moderate either, kind of ideologically pretty lined up with him, but someone who demographically sort of represents a lot of the change that's happening in the Democratic Party these days.
So I think I read when you were talking about to sort of put that in contrast with what we saw in the Republican nominating convention and in the Republican Party, I think that I read that there is this sort of notion that the Republican Party has become a sort of personal extension of Donald Trump. And so I'm interested in understanding sort of what do you mean by that? So who are the Republicans and what do they stand for? And is Donald Trump one of them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true that in a lot of kind of superficial ways, the Republicans have very much become the party of Trump. I mean, he's such a dominant figure. We really don't have any, I think, equivalents, certainly in our own experience in American politics, of someone who just so personally, so thoroughly kind of dominates the political landscape. And certainly within the Republican Party, he really does. The convention was very much a celebration of him personally and his family and the people who work for him. They were sort of a lot of the speakers and the voices that you heard at that convention. But I think there's another part of that is the sort of a slightly less told story, which is kind of maybe the more political scientist kind of way to look at it, that there's another side of this too, which is the extent to which Trump has himself changed to sort of fit within the Republican Party more. And if you sort of think about how he ran 4 years ago, he ran to some extent as kind of an ideological maverick, as someone who sort of did not fit the standard conservative Republican ideological box, fit in that box, especially on trade, but also talking about protecting entitlement programs from cuts, talking about covering people on a healthcare plan, infrastructure investments, and even going after Wall Street and going after CEOs who move jobs overseas. He really struck a lot of people as a kind of a different kind of Republican. In fact, we even saw in the national election studies, if you look, it just asks people, where do you put the candidates on a kind of a left-right spectrum? Trump was rated the most moderate Republican since at least 1972, since they started asking that question on the national election studies. So what's happened really over his presidency, somewhat maybe to some people surprising, but maybe to political scientists a little less surprising, has been the party has had an effect on him as well. And he's become a much more conventional conservative over the course of his presidency than he really was as a candidate 4 years ago. And we've really seen himself kind of move in the direction of the Republican Party, sort of ideologically, and not wanting to kind of start a fight with people on his right within the party. And having had not even one, but two chiefs of staff from the House Freedom Caucus, which is the rightmost bloc of Republicans in the House. That is somewhat surprising based on what candidate Trump looked like 4 years ago, but maybe not so surprising to those of us who are sensitive to ways in which parties exert a lot of impact on the behavior of individual politicians.
So that ties in, I think, nicely to some of what you talk about in asymmetric politics, which is sort of my next question, which I want to ask is, does it make sense to even talk about Democrats and Republicans in the same sort of breath, right? You suggest in asymmetric politics that there is this deep asymmetry between the parties, that Democrats are a group coalition, and you alluded to that when you were talking about the Biden campaign. And Republicans are best understood maybe as an ideological movement. And so I'm wondering if you can sort of walk us through that argument a little bit in a kind of condensed fashion of sort of like, what do you mean by that? How did we get this way? And then how do we understand its implications? And I think maybe one implication is something that you just described for us, which is the sort of transformation from candidate Trump to President Trump.
Sure. Well, the premise of the book, which I co-wrote with my longtime friend and collaborator Matt Grossman of Michigan State, is basically that we shouldn't think of the Democrats and Republicans as two animals of the same species, sort of mirror image equivalents of each other. They're in fact very different kinds of parties, and that essentially the Republican Party is the agent of an ideological movement. It is basically the vehicle of the modern American conservative movement, its electoral and governing arm. And Republicans, many Republican supporters are attracted to the party for ideological reasons, because they see the party as standing for certain broad ideological principles like limited government or traditional social values, things like that. And that fights within the Republican Party are often fights about who's the bit better conservative, who's the farthest to the right, and the Democrats are very much seen as the enemy, as the left. That the Democrats are the left, and politics in general is a sort of an existential fight between the left and the right, and it's the Republican Party's role to represent the right in that battle. Whereas our view is the Democratic Party doesn't really operate like that. The Democratic Party, of course, has liberals in it as one constituency, but it's not a liberal party the same way the Republicans are a conservative party. A lot of Democratic voters, when you ask them why they're Democrats, what they like about the Democratic Party, they don't talk about left versus right. They don't say, I'm a liberal, the Democrats are on the left, so therefore I'm a Democrat. What they say is things like, the Democrats are the party for women. The Democrats are the party for the working class. The Democrats are party for racial minorities, or for gay people, or for people who are non-Christians. Or in other words, they sort of see the Democratic Party as representing a group identity or group interest, and the Democrats together are kind of this coalition of a bunch of these different groups who are kind of all under this umbrella. And often when there are fights in the Democratic tent, they're fights that pit the different groups against each other, as opposed to left versus, far left versus center, that sort of thing. And Democrats just don't talk or think in ideological language the same way that Republicans do. And Democrats tend to be more interested in pragmatism as a result. Democratic politicians sort of see their role not so much about upholding some kind of sacred tradition of liberal values or progressive values, but really about delivering policies to particular groups within the coalition that will make their lives better in concrete ways. And so their style of governing tends to be more pragmatic, more open to compromise than the Republican style of governing. And so there are all kinds of implications that come from the fact that the parties really are kind of different animals who sort of operate differently internally, and they relate to each other differently.
So in your second book, or in Red Fighting Blue, I should say, you sort of bring geography into this argument and talk more about the relationship between the parties and voters, as that relationship is mediated by geography and by the features of our electoral system. And, you know, I think most of us are very familiar with the red state versus blue state map that has sort of been seared in our brains. And that's often the way that we approach thinking about politics. And that's not fully revealing of what's actually going on in American politics. And in fact, it sort of renders invisible some of the dynamics that we need to sort of think about. Could you talk about that a little bit, about what the red versus blue state map does reveal, and then what kinds of things it renders invisible?
Sure. Well, it certainly reveals that there is more sort of consistent, stable regional division in American electoral politics than there used to be. We're really in an era that's sort of historically unparalleled of most states being kind of safely in the camp of one party or the other, not just in presidential elections, but increasingly in congressional and state level elections. With the sort of the same few swing states pretty much every year, mostly. Pennsylvania, certainly one of them. But here in Massachusetts, you know, it's pretty blue, and, you know, there's no reason to believe it won't be pretty blue for a long time. And this, of course, has implications for, you know, for who gets elected to Congress. It's a lot easier to be at the ideological extremes if you've got a constituency that's rock solid for your party, and you don't have to worry about getting defeated in a general election. And so it means that there's reason to sort of encourage polarization of the parties because we have such safe constituencies. And for the candidates in presidential elections, it means they can kind of narrow their scope because of the Electoral College to a few states and major states in the country, you know, Florida, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and a whole lot of other states where a lot of people live, you know, sort of get ignored. But the sense in which it's sort of overly simplistic is that, you know, this is a function to a large extent of our electoral rules, which are winner take all. And what that means is that, you know, once a state is safe, it sort of, you know, doesn't really matter what the margin is, and it doesn't really matter. And the people who are kind of in the minority party in that state don't end up with that much of a voice. So, you know, there are going to be 40% of people in most blue states who will vote for Donald Trump this year, and 40% or so, maybe even more in some cases, of people in red states who will vote for Biden, but they're not really getting represented because the whole state, you know, with winner take all system, the whole state just sort of goes into the column of the majority party. And so we can sometimes exaggerate the extent of political division that actually exists out there among voters by just talking about red states and blue states. Not everybody in a blue state is a Democrat. Not everyone in the red state is Republican. We need to keep that in mind. At the same time, we have an electoral system that encourages us, if we're just thinking about outcomes, you know, who wins the election, to very much see that these days, most elections are pretty predictable. And these geographic coalitions are pretty stable from one year to the next, no matter who the specific candidates are or what's going on in the country.
So I was really struck with the evidence that you provide in your book to make the case that Americans are not, our views on social issues are not necessarily mapped onto geography, but geography sort of has the consequence of mapping our differences onto the national political landscape. And you make this point several times that you were just sort of alluding to a minute ago, that the weight of a citizen's ballot depends on geographic context. And so at first glance, that might strike us as being anti-democratic in a system that prioritizes political equality. But what you point out is that this is a feature of American democracy, that our constitutional system intimately links geography and representation together. And so I'm just sort of wondering, how do we reconcile that in a way that, how do we become comfortable with that in a way that allows us to kind of retain our faith in American democracy when it comes to questions of political equality, assuming that we still can have faith and confidence in democracy, which I very much do have. Just sort of theoretically, how do we hold those things together at the same time?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I don't claim to be able to give a complete informed answer on on what this means for American democracy. I think we just need to to understand that our form of democracy is a very complicated one. It's a very institutionally complicated one. Our Constitution is complicated. Our electoral system is complicated, and geography. And the geographic-based system we have means that, yes, theoretically, votes don't all count the same. We're seeing this right now with the Electoral College, obviously. The possibility that we could once again this year, as we have had in two of the most recent, fairly recent elections, a discrepancy between the electoral winner and the popular vote winner. And that same thing happens in congressional elections too. It doesn't get the same attention, but it's happened several times that one party will get more votes for, especially in the Senate, and the other party will wind up with more seats. And I think, one thing I guess we can say is that, this is a limitation of pure democracy, of pure majoritarianism. It's one of the compromises that made the country able to be founded in the first place, that got the small states, and the North and the South together in 1787. And so in order for that to happen, there had to be certain concessions made, and we're still living with the consequences of those concessions more than 200 years later. So I think one can still have faith in the democracy and still note that there are things that are maybe not purely democratic about our system, and that has certain implications, right? For example, for the Democrats right now, well, they're going to have to think about appealing to white non-college voters maybe more than they have in the past, because those voters are sort of well located in battleground states in the Electoral College, and so you have to shift your strategy accordingly. Some voters will get a little bit more attention than they would have under a pure popular vote. And that's just sort of the kind of thing that has to be done in order to, can sort of continue this form of American democracy that we have. And we can recognize that there are flaws and compromises and complications with it, as well as having faith in it.
Yeah. I want to sort of shift the question a little bit, because I know that you also study the American presidency. You've talked a little bit today about the consequences of regional polarization for the way that candidates campaign, the way that presidential candidates campaign. I'm interested to hear sort of how this all matters, the relationship between parties and geography when it comes to executive power. If parties at one time sort of allowed presidents to bridge geographic divisions, and parties are now sort of more defined by geography in some way, what are the consequences for the relationship between the American president and the American people? How do we understand presidential leadership and executive power in a landscape of such polarization, geographic polarization?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. Probably the Electoral College and winner-take-all politics means that in an era like we have now, where we have very sharp regional divides in elections, presidents can sort of govern, with an eye towards not necessarily the whole country. They can care mostly about the states that they plan to win in the Electoral College, and maybe they don't have to worry too much about appealing to the rest of the country. We see this with a current president who, sometimes talks somewhat dismissively about, say, New York City or California or places that aren't going to vote for him in the Electoral College. Well, if we had a popular vote system, a pure popular vote system, there would presumably be more of an incentive for him to, I mean, there are still a lot of votes in New York City. There are a lot of votes in California. If he were worried about winning the national popular vote, he might think, I need to reach out more to what we would now call the blue states. And similarly with Obama, that Obama could serve for 8 years and not have to worry too much about what people in Mississippi thought about him or people in North Dakota thought about him. And he could pursue policies that were maybe unpopular there, but it didn't really matter so much. He didn't need them to win. I do think that probably there's a connection of sorts between the geographic polarization that we're seeing and kind of the ideological polarization and the ideological and the partisanship of not only members of Congress, but the president as well.
Mm-hmm. We're just about out of time, but I wanted to sort of ask you one final question. Muhlenberg College is an undergraduate institution, and Muhlenberg students are our primary audience. And so I wanted to try to wrap up by talking a little bit about partisanship and engagement of young people. I did see that you co-authored an article recently that examines young people's partisanship and political engagement. And young people are increasingly detached from political parties. Some of that is a consequence of the party's reluctance to recruit young people, or their inattention to interests and concerns of young people. Perhaps some of that is a reaction to increased ideological polarization. But you also note that young voters have been and can still be critically important in determining electoral outcomes. And so I wanted to just sort of talk with you about this a little bit. During key historical moments, and perhaps we are in one of those right now, in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of a resurgence in activity and power in the Black Lives Movement, that may be positioning young voters to be even more important. And so I know you've studied this a little bit, and I'm interested in sort of what you've learned and what you think about the potential of young voters in the 2020 elections.
Yeah, young voters are, they have a lot of potential power, and it's seldom exercised power. There are a lot of people who, once they get to be eligible to vote and to otherwise be politically active, don't necessarily take that opportunity. And that's not a criticism, it's just an observation of the truth, that turnout rates among young people are always much lower than among older people. And that's true up until, even people my age are not quite as participatory as people a bit older than us. But it's a kind of a chicken and egg problem where young people say, well, we don't really hear the issues we care about being discussed as much, so we don't participate. Well, but when you don't participate, you're not going to hear the issues that you care about discussed as much. So someone has to break that cycle. And what I certainly say to my students is that it's very understandable to be cynical about politics, and especially partisan politics. But the parties are pretty much here to stay. If we know anything from our political science expertise, it's that parties are an inevitable part of democracy. And if you want to change things, for example, I have lots of students who complain about the polarization. The parties are too far apart. I said, well, part of the reason that's true is that people who want more moderation and more cooperation, they've just sort of checked out of the parties. They're not working within the parties to move them closer together. And so the people who are within the parties working hard are the people on the extremes. And so one solution is, even if you don't like parties very much, join a party anyway, try to work from within that party, vote in primary elections as well as general elections, because as I point out in my research, in a lot of parts of the country, it's the primary election is where the real competition is. The general election is a safe, foregone conclusion. Work in primaries, work within the party system to try to make the parties more open, more moderate, more responsive to the the priorities and the interests of young people. And that's really, it's not easy work, but that's really the only way that we know we make things a little bit better.
Well, thank you for that. And sadly, I think I have moved into the older voter category. That no longer applies to me. But
I'm quickly on that way myself.
so I'm sure that everyone watching this will agree with me that you have given us a lot of important ideas to think about as we head into the final weeks of the 2020 campaigns. I look forward to reading your next book whenever that is going to come out, and to continuing to read your blog and talk about the ideas that you've shared with us today. To everybody that is watching this, you can find more information about our program, 2020 Vision, Contested Political Futures, by checking the Muhlenberg College Political Science website. And just to echo what Dr. Hopkins said, please join me in voting this November. Dr. Hopkins, thank you so much for your time and for talking with us today.
Oh, of course, it was a lot of fun, and enjoy the election down there in your swing state. I'm really jealous.
Very exciting down here indeed. Thank you so much.